The massive crystal dome of the Galactic Council hummed with the voices of 1,000 species, each more advanced than the last. Today brought another routine evaluation of a newly discovered civilization, one that barely deserved the title. The holographic displays showed a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, inhabited by bipedal creatures who had somehow stumbled into basic space travel. Ambassador Thrix adjusted his forearms as he reviewed the preliminary data. The species called themselves humans, and their technology was so primitive it was almost charming. They still use chemical rockets to escape their gravity well, burned fossil fuels for energy, and their most advanced weapons were barely more sophisticated than throwing rocks really hard. "Honored delegates," Thrix announced, his voice carrying across the chamber through universal translators, "I present the species known as humanity." The hologram shifted to show images of human cities, their clumsy spacecraft, and their laughably basic military equipment. As you can see, they have achieved minimal spaceflight capability, using crude chemical propulsion systems that most of our civilizations abandoned during their Stone Ages. Scattered laughter rippled through the assembled delegates. The Vorthan representative, a crystalline being that communicated through light patterns, flashed what could only be described as amusement. The hegemony's military advisor, a towering figure with chitinous armor, made a sound that their translator interpreted as barely contained mirth. The display zoomed in on human military installations. Aircraft carriers floating on liquid water, submarines hiding beneath the surface, and soldiers carrying projectile weapons that fired small metal bullets. The primitive nature of it all was staggering. These humans had discovered gunpowder and thought they were ready for galactic warfare. Their nuclear weapons, Thrix continued, operate on principles of atomic fission and fusion. The energy yield is approximately equivalent to a child's learning toy from any civilized world. More laughter echoed through the chamber. They appear to believe that splitting atoms is somehow impressive. Dr. Yenna, the Council's chief science officer, leaned forward in her biomechanical chair. Her species had mastered matter manipulation millions of years ago, and watching humans celebrate their atomic bombs was like watching insects discover fire. "What about their space-based weapons?" she asked. Thrix's expression grew even more amused. "Ah yes, their latest innovation. They call it a kinetic bombardment system." The hologram showed orbital platforms and long metal rods. "They have apparently discovered that dropping heavy objects from space can cause damage." They seemed quite proud of this revelation. The chamber erupted in genuine laughter now. The concept was so absurdly simple that it bordered on comedy. Using gravity as a weapon? It was like using a hammer to perform surgery when precision molecular disintegrators existed. The Korthik delegate, a warrior species known for their brutal efficiency, actually stood up to get a better look at the display. "They drop metal sticks from orbit?" The Korthik growled through his translator. "This is their super weapon?" "Indeed," Thrix confirmed. "Tungsten rods, approximately 6 meters in length, dropped from orbital platforms. They call them various names, but the most common appears to be rods from God or Thor's hammer. They seem to believe this represents the pinnacle of military innovation." The absurdity was overwhelming. Every species in the chamber had weapons that could crack planets, disintegrate matter at the molecular level, or manipulate space-time itself. The idea that anyone would consider dropping metal rods to be advanced. Warfare was beyond comprehension. A new figure entered the chamber, escorted by 2 council guards. Commander Riles of the Terran Defense Force walked with the steady gait of a career military officer, his weathered face showing no emotion as he took his place at the designated podium. His simple uniform looked almost quaint compared to the exotic materials and energy fields that clothed the other delegates. "Commander Riles," Ambassador Thrix addressed him with barely concealed condescension, "you have been granted the opportunity to address this council regarding humanity's military capabilities. Please proceed." Riles surveyed the assembled aliens. With calm eyes, he had been briefed on what to expect. Earth's deep space monitoring stations had detected energy signatures that defied human understanding. Ships that moved faster than light and weapons that could reshape matter itself. By comparison, humanity's best efforts look like Stone Age tools. Honored delegates, Riles began, his voice steady despite the obvious amusement his presence was causing. Earth appreciates this opportunity to present our defensive capabilities to the galactic community. He gestured to the holographic display, which still showed the orbital kinetic bombardment platforms. I understand there has been some discussion about our kinetic systems. Discussion might be too generous a term, the Vorthan delegate flashed, their crystalline form pulsing with what the translator interpreted as barely restrained hilarity. Riles nodded slowly. I see. Well, I hope you'll forgive our primitive methods. We're still learning about the galaxy and its more advanced civilizations. He paused, studying the faces around him. I notice you've focused quite a bit on our delivery systems, but I wonder if you've paid much attention to what we're actually dropping. Thrix waved dismissively. Tungsten rods, as you call them. Dense metal projectiles that rely on kinetic energy for damage. Hardly revolutionary. Tungsten is indeed the base material, Riles agreed. But I think you might be surprised by what we've learned to do with it. He gestured to the display, which showed detailed schematics of the rods. You see, we've discovered something interesting about consciousness and its relationship to matter. At the quantum level, the laughter in the chamber began to fade as delegates leaned forward, curiosity replacing amusement. Consciousness manipulation was an advanced field that few species had mastered. We found, Riles continued, that human consciousness can be integrated into inanimate objects under certain conditions. The process is still experimental, but the results have been quite remarkable. He paused, allowing the implications to sink in. Each tungsten rod is subjected to what we call consciousness integration before deployment. Dr. Yenna's biomechanical chair hummed as she processed this information. You're claiming to have achieved consciousness transference into metallic projectiles? Not transference, Riles corrected. Integration. We don't move consciousness from one place to another. We imbue the projectiles with specific emotional states and mental patterns. He smiled slightly. Turns out humans are particularly good at making things angry. The chamber fell silent. The concept was theoretically possible, but practically impossible for most species. Consciousness manipulation required precise control over quantum states, something that typically took millennia to master. The process is quite simple, Riles explained. We select volunteers who focus their most intense frustrations into the tungsten matrix. The metal absorbs and retains these emotional patterns, creating projectiles that are, for lack of a better term, really annoyed about their targets. Ambassador Thrix leaned forward. You're telling us that you've weaponized anger itself? In a manner of speaking, yes, Riles confirmed. We've found that angry tungsten behaves quite differently from regular tungsten. It seems to take the concept of kinetic energy somewhat personally. The implications were staggering, but most delegates still couldn't take the claim seriously. Using emotions as weapons was the stuff of ancient legends, not modern warfare. I think, Riles said quietly, you might want to pay closer attention to our next field test. The Council's final vote was swift and predictable. Humanity was classified as a developing species with primitive technology and no significant threat to galactic civilization. They would be granted standard protections and left alone to develop naturally. As the session concluded and delegates began to file out, few paid attention to the small addendum Commander Riles submitted to the official record. It was a simple request for notification when the next Korthic raiding fleet entered human space. Along with coordinates for optimal observation of the upcoming weapons test, the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had just made their first major mistake regarding humanity. They had focused on the weapons delivery system while completely ignoring what was being delivered. Soon they would learn that sometimes the most dangerous innovations come from the most unexpected places, and that underestimating a species' capacity for creative spite was never a good idea. The universe was about to discover that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology. It was their unparalleled ability to make inanimate objects really, really mad about things. The emergency beacon cut through the void of space like a scream in the darkness. 3 months had passed since the Galactic Council's dismissal of humanity, and now the Korthek raiding fleet had gone silent in the most disturbing way possible. Not destroyed, not defeated, but simply gone as if they had never existed at all. Dr. Yenna floated in her biomechanical chair within the Council's deep space monitoring station. Her 6 eyes focused on readings that made no sense. The scanner data from the Korthak fleet's last known position showed energy signatures that her instruments insisted were impossible. Space itself appeared to be damaged, wounded in ways that physics claimed couldn't happen. "Show me the gravitational." "Readings again," she commanded, her voice tight with concern. The holographic display materialized around her, showing a 3-dimensional map of the area where the Korthak fleet had vanished. What she saw defied every law of physics she had studied in her 200-year career, the space around the impact. Coordinates wasn't just empty, it was angry. The fabric of reality showed stress patterns that looked almost like emotional scarring. Gravitational fields fluctuated in ways that suggested the universe itself was having a bad day. Quantum particles in the area had apparently decided to stop following the rules that had governed them since the beginning of time. On Earth, Commander Riles stood in the Orbital Weapons Control Center, watching the aftermath of their first successful field tests through powerful telescopes. The tungsten rod designation, Spite 7, had performed better than anyone had dared hope. The 6-meter projectile had been subjected to consciousness integration using a volunteer who had spent the previous day dealing with a malfunctioning computer system. The volunteer, a technician named Dave, had focused 8 hours of pure technological frustration into the tungsten matrix. The rod had absorbed his anger about frozen screens, corrupted files, and error messages that made no sense. When launched, it hadn't just fallen toward the Korthek fleet. It had descended with the focused fury of everyone who had ever wanted to throw their computer out a window. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Brooke, monitoring the deep space sensors, "we're getting some interesting readings from the impact site." She paused, reviewing the data with obvious confusion. "The tungsten fragments are still showing consciousness signatures 3 months after impact." Riles moved to her station, studying the readouts. The pieces of Spite 7 weren't just debris. They were still angry, still remembering the frustration that had been focused into them. And that persistent rage was doing something to the space around them that human science couldn't explain. "Are you saying the metal is still conscious?" Riles asked. "Not conscious in the traditional sense," Brooke replied. "But it's definitely still mad about something. The quantum resonance patterns suggest it's holding a grudge against the entire concept of organized matter." Back at the Council station, Dr. Yenna received the preliminary report from the investigation team that had been dispatched to the anomaly site. The science vessel Quantum Harmony had arrived at the coordinates 3 days ago, crewed by the galaxy's most brilliant researchers. What they found had shaken their understanding of reality itself. The ship's AI had been the first to notice the problem. Upon entering the affected area, it had immediately begun reporting that local spacetime was experiencing significant mood difficulties. The computer systems had started malfunctioning in ways that suggested they were being criticized by the universe itself. The investigation team reports that the area shows signs of what they're calling persistent metaphysical irritation. Dr. Yenna read from the transmitted data. Space itself appears to be holding a grudge against the concept of existing in an organized fashion. The implications were staggering. The human projectile hadn't just destroyed the Korthek fleet. It had somehow convinced the local fabric of reality to be annoyed about the whole situation. The tungsten fragments were still broadcasting their frustration into the quantum foam, and the universe was apparently listening. Meanwhile, on Earth, the success of the consciousness integration program had triggered a massive expansion of the project. Dr. Williams, the lead scientist, discovered that different types of human emotion produced different effects when focused into the tungsten matrix. Mild irritation created standard kinetic impacts. Focused anger could punch through. energy shields that should have been impenetrable. But pure, existential fury produced projectiles that reality itself seemed to fear. The breakthrough came when they tested a rod integrated with the consciousness of a woman named Carol, who had spent the previous morning trying to cancel a subscription service. The resulting projectile, designated Frustration 1, had been launched at a test asteroid. Instead of simply destroying the target, it had somehow convinced the asteroid to stop existing in an organized fashion. The rock had disbanded itself at the molecular level, apparently deciding that being a coherent object was too much trouble. "We're not just dropping metal rods anymore," Dr. Williams reported to the expanding research team. "We're dropping weaponized emotions that happen to be shaped like metal rods." The military applications were obvious, but the scientific implications were revolutionary. Humans had accidentally discovered that consciousness and physics were connected in ways that nobody had imagined. The universe apparently had feelings, and those feelings could be hurt by sufficiently angry tungsten. The research team began experimenting with other emotions. Disappointment created projectiles that caused enemy systems to malfunction out of shame. Sarcasm produced ammunition that made target computers question their own existence. Petty resentment generated weapons that remembered every slight and retaliated with disproportionate force, but the most disturbing discovery came from the civilian population. Humans who had been exposed to the consciousness-integrated weapons were beginning to develop what could only be called reality-adjacent abilities. Workers in the tungsten processing facilities found they could make broken equipment work properly just by being really annoyed at it. Engineers discovered they could solve impossible problems by getting genuinely frustrated with the laws of physics. The phenomenon was spreading. Across Earth, reports came in of humans unconsciously influencing probability, making impossible shots and causing malfunctioning systems to work correctly through sheer force of will. It was as if humanity's natural capacity for stubborn determination was beginning to affect the world around them. Dr. Yenna compiled her final report for the Council with growing alarm. The humans hadn't just weaponized their emotions. They had apparently discovered that emotions could be used to negotiate with reality itself. And reality, it seemed, was surprisingly willing to compromise when faced with sufficiently determined human spite. The report documented phenomena that challenged every known law of physics. Gravity that seemed personally offended by attempts to measure it. Electromagnetic fields that appeared to be holding grudges against scientific instruments. Quantum particles that had decided to stop cooperating with the fundamental forces of the universe. The human species, Dr. Yenna concluded, in her report, appears to have achieved something that we considered impossible. They have convinced the universe that the laws of physics are more like suggestions, and they have done so through the simple expedient of being really, really annoyed about those laws. The Council's emergency session was called for the following day. Representatives from every major civilization would gather to discuss the implications of humanity's impossible achievement. The species that had been dismissed as primitive had somehow managed to weaponize the concept of being frustrated, and it was working with terrifying efficiency. The universe itself was apparently taking sides in galactic conflicts now, and it had chosen to support the species that was most willing to argue with the fundamental nature of reality. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who refuses to accept that something is impossible. As Dr. Yenna prepared her presentation for the Council, she couldn't shake the feeling that humanity had fundamentally changed the rules of existence itself. They had looked at the laws of physics and decided those laws were stupid, and somehow they had convinced the universe to agree with them. The galaxy was about to enter a new era, one where the most primitive species had become the most dangerous. Simply by refusing to accept that their weapons shouldn't work, humanity's greatest victory wasn't technological. It was philosophical. They had won an argument with reality itself, and reality had apparently decided to let them have their way. The sterile white walls of the orbital research facility hummed with activity as Dr. Williams observed the latest batch of consciousness integration subjects. These weren't soldiers or scientists, but ordinary people who had volunteered to participate in what the military had officially designated as Project Angry Metal. The unofficial name was far less diplomatic. Today's test subjects included ADMV employee who had spent the morning dealing with people who couldn't fill out basic forms, a customer service representative who had just finished a 4-hour shift of explaining why the customer was wrong, and a man named Bob who had been trying to assemble furniture with instructions that were apparently written by someone who had never seen furniture before. The key, Dr. Williams explained to her research team, is finding the right type of frustration for each projectile. Not all anger is created equal. She gestured to the tungsten rods suspended in the consciousness integration chamber. Mild irritation creates standard kinetic impacts. Focused professional frustration can punch through energy shields. But existential rage, the kind that comes from dealing with bureaucracy or impossible technology, creates projectiles that reality itself seems to respect. The DMV employee, a woman named Ruth, approached the integration chamber with the weary expression of someone who had spent years explaining to people that, yes, they really did need to bring 3 forms of identification to renew their license. The tungsten rod before her was designated Bureaucracy 4, and it would be the first projectile to be integrated with pure administrative annoyance. Just think about your worst day at work, Dr. Williams instructed gently. Focus on that feeling when someone argues with you about rules that you didn't make and can't change. Ruth closed her eyes and let the memories flow. The man who had insisted his expired license was still valid because he believed it should be. The woman who had argued for 30 minutes about why she shouldn't need to take a vision test. The teenager who had brought a hand-drawn birth certificate and seemed genuinely surprised that it wasn't acceptable, the tungsten rod began to vibrate with what the monitoring equipment could only describe as malevolent administrative authority. The metal itself seemed to be developing an attitude about proper procedures and the importance of following established protocols. When the integration was complete, Bureaucracy 4 hummed with the focused power of someone who had the authority to make your life difficult and the experience to do it efficiently. Meanwhile, the customer service representative, Tom, was preparing to integrate his consciousness into a rod designated Helpdesk 2. His contribution would be the crystallized essence of explaining the same simple concept to different people 17 times in a single day, each time with slightly less patience than the last. Remember, Dr. Williams coached, it's not just about being angry. It's about being angry while maintaining professional courtesy. That's a very specific type of frustration. Tom nodded, drawing on memories of callers who had demanded to speak to his manager because they didn't like the answer he had given them. The tungsten rod absorbed his focused irritation about people who called technical support, but refused to follow technical instructions. When the integration was complete, Helpdesk 2 radiated the patient fury of someone who had been asked to fix problems that weren't actually problems. The real breakthrough came with Bob's session. The furniture assembly manual had been written in what appeared to be a combination of 3 different languages, none of which seemed to correspond to any known human tongue. The diagrams showed bolts that didn't exist, tools that weren't included, and assembly steps that violated several laws of physics. "I've been working on this bookshelf for 6 hours," Bob explained to the research team. "The instructions say to attach Part A to Part B using connector C, but Part A doesn't have the right holes, Part B is the wrong size, and connector C is apparently sold separately." Dr. Williams watched the integration process with fascination. Bob's frustration wasn't just about furniture. It was about the fundamental disconnect between what instructions claimed would happen and what actually happened when you tried to follow them. The tungsten rod, designated Assembly 1, began to resonate with the pure exasperation of someone who had been betrayed by the very concept of logical instruction. The testing phase began immediately. Bureaucracy 4 was launched at a decommissioned spacecraft, and the results were spectacular. The projectile didn't just destroy the target. It filed a complaint with the universe about the ship's improper existence and then processed the paperwork to have reality remove it from the local space-time registry. The ship didn't explode. It was simply discontinued due to administrative irregularities. HelpDisk 2 produced even more interesting results. When fired at a shielded target, the projectile somehow convinced the energy shield that it was configured incorrectly and needed to be restarted. The shield dutifully shut down, rebooted, and then discovered that it had forgotten how to work properly. The tungsten rod passed through the confused defensive system and struck the target with the satisfied impact of someone who had successfully walked a customer through turning their device off and on again. But Assembly 1 created phenomena that challenged every assumption about how weapons should work. The projectile approached its target, consulted some kind of internal instruction manual, became confused about which part of the enemy ship it was supposed to hit, and then apparently decided that the entire target was assembled incorrectly. The enemy vessel began to disassemble itself in a systematic fashion, as if it had suddenly realized that its components were attached in the wrong order. The research team documented each test with growing amazement. The consciousness-integrated projectiles weren't just weapons. They were philosophical statements about the nature of reality, delivered at high velocity with extreme prejudice. Dr. Williams compiled her findings with a mixture of excitement and concern. The human capacity for focused frustration appeared to be unlimited, and that frustration could be weaponized in ways that defied conventional understanding of cause and effect. The tungsten rods weren't just carrying kinetic energy, they were carrying human determination, and that determination was proving to be more powerful than the fundamental forces of the universe. The expansion of the program was immediate and dramatic. Military researchers across Earth began experimenting with different types of human emotion. The Navy developed passive-aggressive torpedoes that made enemy ships feel guilty about attacking in the first place. The Air Force created petty missiles that remembered every slight and retaliated with disproportionate force. The Army perfected frustrated artillery that became more accurate the more obstacles it encountered, but the most significant development came from an unexpected source. The civilian population, exposed to the consciousness-integrated weapons through their work in the production facilities, began to develop what could only be described as reality-adjacent abilities. Workers found they could make broken equipment work properly by being sufficiently annoyed at it. Engineers discovered they could solve impossible problems by getting genuinely frustrated with the laws of physics. The phenomenon was spreading beyond the military complex. Across Earth, reports arrived of humans unconsciously influencing probability, making impossible shots, and causing malfunctioning systems to work correctly through sheer force of will. It was as if humanity's natural capacity for stubborn determination was beginning to affect the world around them in measurable ways. Dr. Williams received reports from across the planet. A mechanic in Detroit who had fixed a car engine by yelling at it until it decided to work properly. A software engineer in Tokyo who had debugged a program by being so frustrated with it that the code had rearranged itself into a working configuration. A teacher in London who had maintained classroom discipline by projecting disappointment so effectively that the students had apologized to their desks. The implications were staggering. Humanity wasn't just weaponizing their emotions, they were discovering that emotions could be used to negotiate with reality itself, and reality, faced with sufficiently determined human spite, was apparently willing to compromise on some of its more rigid rules. The research team began to understand that they had stumbled onto something far more significant than a new weapon system. They had discovered that consciousness and physics were connected in ways that nobody had imagined. The universe apparently had feelings, and those feelings could be influenced by sufficiently focused human determination. The military applications were obvious, but the civilian implications were revolutionary. If humans could influence reality through focused emotion, what else might be possible? Could they negotiate with entropy itself? Could they convince the laws of thermodynamics to be more flexible? Could they argue with time and convince it to slow down during important moments? The testing continued around the clock. Each new experiment revealed additional capabilities that shouldn't have been possible. The tungsten rods were no longer just projectiles. They were ambassadors of human determination, sent to negotiate with the universe on behalf of a species that had never learned to accept that something was impossible. As Dr. Williams prepared her report for the military leadership, she realized that humanity had crossed a threshold. They had moved beyond simply using technology to achieve their goals. They had learned to use their emotions as a direct interface with reality itself. The universe was apparently willing to listen to sufficiently determined complaints about how things should work. The galaxy was about to discover that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their tactics. It was their absolute refusal to accept that the laws of physics were non-negotiable. They had looked at the fundamental rules of existence and decided those rules were stupid, and somehow they had convinced the universe to agree with them. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened under circumstances that would have been impossible to imagine just months earlier. The great crystal dome buzzed with urgent conversations as representatives from every major civilization gathered to discuss what their scientists were calling the human problem. The term had evolved from mockery to genuine concern and record time. Dr. Yena's presentation began with holographic displays that showed readings no instrument should have been able to detect. The space around human territory was developing what her equipment insisted on classifying as emotional weather patterns. Regions of reality were experiencing mood swings that affected the behavior of fundamental forces. Gravity wells were becoming irritable. Electromagnetic fields were holding grudges. Quantum particles were apparently staging organized protests against the concept of consistent behavior. "The phenomenon is spreading," Dr. Yena reported to the assembled delegates, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Human consciousness integrated. Weapons have created what we can only describe as reality fatigue in affected areas. The universe itself appears to be getting tired of maintaining consistent physical laws." Ambassador Thrix leaned forward in his chair, his forearms gesturing in disbelief. "You're telling us that these primitives have somehow convinced the universe to be lazy?" "Not lazy," Dr. Yena corrected. "Frustrated. The affected regions show signs of what our computers keep classifying as chronic irritation syndrome, spacetime. Is experiencing stress fractures that look suspiciously like the kind of tension headaches that sentient beings get after dealing with bureaucracy." The implications were staggering. The Vorthan delegate's crystalline form flashed with patterns that the universal translator interpreted as existential dread. The hegemony's military representative had begun making low growling sounds that suggested deep concern about the nature of reality itself. Admiral Kors of the hegemony Defense Force stood to address the council. His fleet had been monitoring the human system for weeks, and what they observed had shaken the confidence of the galaxy's most experienced warriors. "My ships have detected human vessels equipped with weapons that appear to argue with physics and win," he reported. "Yesterday, we observed a human destroyer convince an asteroid field to rearrange itself into a more convenient configuration for navigation." The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The humans weren't just using their emotions as weapons. They were using them as a form of diplomatic communication with the universe itself. "The human military appears to have developed what they call emotional physics," Admiral Kors continued. "Their weapons don't just deliver kinetic energy. They deliver philosophical arguments about how reality should work, and reality appears to be listening." On Earth, the success of the consciousness integration program had triggered what historians would later call the weaponized emotion revolution. The breakthrough had come when researchers discovered that human emotions could be layered and combined to create increasingly sophisticated effects. A projectile integrated with customer service frustration and bureaucratic annoyance could convince enemy shields that they were configured incorrectly and needed to file a complaint with the manufacturer. Commander Riles, now promoted to admiral, reviewed the daily reports from across the human military complex. The Navy had developed passive-aggressive torpedoes that made enemy ships feel guilty about attacking in the first place. The submarines would surface and transmit messages like, "I'm not angry," just disappointed until the enemy vessels apologized and withdrew from the area. The Air Force had created petty missiles that remembered every slight and retaliated with disproportionate force. These weapons would approach their targets, remind them of every mistake they had ever made, and then explode with the fury of someone who had been keeping a list of grievances for years. But the Army had perhaps achieved the most remarkable innovation with their frustrated artillery. These weapons became more accurate the more obstacles they encountered. Shooting at a target behind cover would cause the projectiles to become so annoyed with the obstruction that they would find creative ways around it. The shells would ricochet off surfaces that should have stopped them, curve around barriers that should have blocked them, and generally behave as if the laws of physics were merely suggestions that could be ignored when convenient. The most disturbing development came from the civilian sector. Humans who had been exposed to the consciousness-integrated weapons were beginning to develop what could only be called reality-adjacent abilities. Factory workers found they could make broken equipment work properly by being sufficiently annoyed at it. Engineers discovered they could solve impossible problems by getting genuinely frustrated with the laws of physics. The phenomenon was spreading beyond the military-industrial complex. Reports arrived from across the planet of humans unconsciously, influencing probability, making impossible shots, and causing malfunctioning systems to work correctly through sheer force of will. A mechanic in Detroit had fixed a car engine by yelling at it until it decided to work properly. A software engineer in Tokyo had debugged a program by being so frustrated with it that the code had rearranged itself into a working configuration. Dr. Williams, now leading an expanded research team, documented the growing capabilities with a mixture of fascination and concern. "We've discovered that human consciousness can interface directly with quantum probability," she reported to the military leadership. "Our emotions appear to be a form of communication that the universe understands and responds to." The breakthrough came when they realized that different combinations of human emotion produced different effects on reality. Disappointment combined with determination created weapons that would continue functioning even when they should have been destroyed. Sarcasm mixed with professional competence produced projectiles that would mock enemy defenses until they shut down in embarrassment. But the most powerful combination was frustration mixed with stubborn refusal to accept defeat. This created weapons that would simply ignore anything that tried to stop them. Energy shields would be dismissed as not a real barrier. Armor plating would be treated as just a suggestion. Enemy vessels would find their defensive systems apologizing for not working properly and then shutting down to avoid further embarrassment. The galactic response was immediate and panicked. The Council dispatched research vessels to study the phenomenon, but the ship's instruments began malfunctioning as soon as they entered human space. The AI systems would start reporting that local reality was having a bad day and that the laws of physics were being unreasonable. The Korthik survivors, when they finally transmitted their emergency beacon, provided the most disturbing evidence yet. The raiding fleet hadn't been destroyed by the human weapons. They had been lectured to death by angry tungsten. The attacking projectiles had somehow developed the ability to project their fury directly into the minds of their targets, delivering not just kinetic damage but existential criticism about the target's life choices. "The metal judged us," the Korthik commander reported through his translator. "It evaluated our decisions and found them wanting. Then it provided detailed feedback about how we could improve our approach to piracy while simultaneously punching holes through our hull." The report continued with increasingly disturbing details. The human projectiles had apparently developed opinions about proper military tactics and had expressed disappointment in the Korthak fleet's lack of strategic thinking. One tungsten rod had actually paused mid-impact to suggest alternative career paths for the crew before continuing with its destructive mission. The Council realized they were facing an unprecedented situation. The humans had somehow weaponized the concept of constructive criticism and delivered it at relativistic speeds. Their projectiles weren't just destroying targets. They were providing performance evaluations while doing so. The economic implications were staggering. Human emotion-enhanced technology was becoming the most sought-after commodity in the galaxy. Civilizations that had once dismissed humanity as primitive now lined up to trade for determined computers that refused to crash no matter how complex the task, and frustrated engines that worked more efficiently when something went wrong. The galaxy's technology markets were being disrupted by products that operated on principles that shouldn't have been possible. Human-made devices came with warranties that guaranteed they would work even if reality disagrees with their specifications. Customer service representatives for other species. Products found themselves having to explain why their equipment couldn't simply ignore the laws of physics when convenient. As the council session continued, reports arrived of human merchant vessels successfully negotiating with asteroids to move out of shipping lanes, and human explorers convincing hostile environments to be more welcoming to visitors. The species that had been dismissed as primitive was rapidly becoming the galaxy's most influential civilization simply by refusing to accept that the universe had rules. The final report of the session was delivered by Dr. Yenna with obvious reluctance. "The human species has achieved something we considered impossible," she announced. "They have successfully negotiated with reality itself and convinced it to be more flexible. The universe appears to be willing to compromise on some of its more rigid rules when faced with sufficiently determined human complaints." The council adjourned with the understanding that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. The species that had been mocked for dropping metal rods from space had somehow convinced those rods to carry philosophical arguments about the nature of existence, and those arguments were winning. The delegates filed out of the chamber in stunned silence, each contemplating the implications of a universe that was apparently willing to negotiate with sufficiently frustrated beings. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had just discovered that their greatest advantage, superior technology, was meaningless against a species that could simply convince reality to ignore technological limitations. Admiral Riles received the Council's preliminary response through diplomatic channels. The message was brief and formal, but the underlying panic was obvious. The galactic community was requesting a meeting to discuss mutual cooperation in the field of consciousness-enhanced technology. The species that had been dismissed as primitive just months ago was now being courted as a potential ally by every major civilization in the galaxy. The transformation was complete. Humanity had evolved from cosmic joke to galactic superpower in less than a year, and they had done it by weaponizing the one thing that every sentient species could understand: the frustration of dealing with things that didn't work the way they were supposed to. The universe itself had apparently decided that human complaints were valid, and it was taking steps to address them. As Admiral Riles prepared for the upcoming diplomatic negotiations, he couldn't help but smile at the irony. Humanity's greatest achievement wasn't technological advancement or military conquest. It was successfully filing a complaint with the universe about the inconvenience of physical laws and getting those laws revised in their favor. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who refuses to accept that the rules apply to them. The observation deck of the Galactic Council's flagship offered a perfect view of the most impossible sight in the known universe. Below them, human space stretched out in all directions, and it was wrong in ways that hurt to contemplate. Stars moved in patterns that suggested they were following traffic laws. Planets orbited their suns with the kind of precision that implied they had received strongly worded letters about their previous orbital mechanics. Space itself seemed to be trying harder. Admiral Riles stood beside Ambassador Thrix, watching as a human cargo vessel approached the diplomatic station. The ship moved through space with the confident momentum of something that had convinced the universe that friction was optional, and that momentum conservation was more of a guideline than a rule. Behind it, reality bent slightly to accommodate its passage, like the cosmos was making room for an honored guest. Your ships still make our instruments malfunction, Thrix observed, his forearms gesturing toward the sensor readings that insisted the human vessel was simultaneously moving faster and slower than it should be. Our computers keep reporting that your engines are running on pure spite and that your navigation systems are guided by aggressive optimism, Riles nodded calmly. The consciousness integration process has some unexpected side effects. Our engineers discovered that if you make a computer angry enough about inefficiency, it starts to take shortcuts through physics that probably shouldn't exist. 6 months had passed since the Galactic Council's emergency session, and the galaxy had adapted to what historians were already calling the human reality revision. The transformation hadn't been gradual. One day, physics worked according to principles that had been constant for billions of years. The next day, those principles had apparently filed for revision and been updated to include provisions for emotional override clauses. Dr. Yenna materialized beside them, her biomechanical chair humming with the kind of technology that had once seemed impossibly advanced. Now it looked quaint compared to human devices that operated on the principle that if you believed in something hard enough, it would probably work regardless of whether it should. The economic analysis is complete, she reported, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had spent months trying to understand market forces that defied rational explanation. Human consciousness-enhanced technology has captured 60% of the galactic market in less than 4 months. The numbers were staggering, but the explanation was simple. Human-made devices came with warranties that guaranteed functionality, even under circumstances that reality finds objectionable. Customer satisfaction surveys showed that buyers appreciated products that would argue with the laws of physics on their behalf rather than simply accepting that something couldn't be done. The most popular item was the determined computer, a processing system that refused to crash regardless of how impossible the task assigned to it. When presented with calculations that should have been impossible, the computers would apparently become annoyed with mathematics itself and negotiate a compromise solution that worked anyway. Our manufacturing division reports that we've received orders for frustrated engines from 47 different species, Dr. Yenna continued. The engines work more efficiently when something goes wrong, which appeals to civilizations that have spent millennia dealing with equipment failures. The frustrated engines were perhaps humanity's most elegant achievement. When faced with mechanical problems, the engines would become increasingly determined to prove that they could work despite the interference. A damaged cooling system would make the engine so annoyed that it would run cooler just to spite the problem. A clogged fuel line would irritate the engine into finding alternative sources of power that shouldn't have existed on Earth. Dr. Williams stood in her expanded laboratory complex, watching the latest generation of consciousness-integrated technology come online. The tungsten rods that had started the revolution were now just one small part of a comprehensive emotional physics program that was reshaping humanity's relationship with reality itself. The latest batch of stubborn shields is ready for testing, reported her assistant, a young engineer whose job title was officially Reality Negotiation Specialist. The shields operated on the principle that if you were sufficiently determined not to be hit by something, the universe would usually respect that decision. The testing phase was routine now. The shields were subjected to various forms of attack, while their consciousness integration systems maintained an attitude of absolutely not, thank you very much. Energy beams would approach the shields, encounter resistance that felt suspiciously like disapproval, and politely redirect themselves elsewhere. Kinetic projectiles would hit the barriers, realize they were being rude, and apologize by bouncing off harmlessly, but the real breakthrough had come with the civilian applications. Humans who had been exposed to consciousness-integrated technology were developing abilities that redefined the relationship between mind and matter. Construction workers found they could convince materials to be stronger than their specifications claimed. Teachers discovered they could maintain classroom discipline by projecting disappointment so effectively that reality itself would step in to restore order. The phenomenon had spread throughout human space with remarkable speed, cities reported. infrastructure that repaired itself when citizens complained about potholes with sufficient determination, traffic systems that would optimize flow patterns in response to drivers' frustration, weather control systems that would actually work when meteorologists got really annoyed with inaccurate forecasts. "We've received another diplomatic request," Riles informed the assembled council representatives. "The hegemony wants to purchase a fleet of ships equipped with passive-aggressive engines, apparently. Their current propulsion systems are too polite to ignore inconvenient physics." The passive-aggressive engines were a marvel of human emotional engineering. They would approach obstacles with the kind of determined politeness that made resistance seem unreasonable. Asteroid fields would part rather than deal with engines that would clearly take any collision as a personal slight. Gravity wells would become apologetic about their inconvenient placement and offer alternative routes through spacetime. The military applications had evolved beyond simple weapons. Human warships now carried disappointed cannons that would make enemy vessels feel bad about attacking in the first place. The projectiles would arrive at their targets accompanied by emotional payloads that conveyed a sense of, "I'm not angry, just disappointed in your life choices." But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of human reality consultants. These specialists could be hired to visit locations where physics was being particularly stubborn and convince it to be more reasonable. Planets with unstable weather patterns could be persuaded to develop more agreeable climates. Star systems with inconvenient orbital mechanics could be talked into more efficient configurations. The galactic economy had restructured itself around human emotional technology. Trade routes now included stops at human-operated physics revision centers, where equipment could be upgraded with consciousness integration. Civilizations competed to hire human engineers who could make their technology work better by the simple expedient of being sufficiently annoyed when it didn't. "The final survey results are in," Dr. Yenna announced, displaying holographic charts that showed impossible data. 83% of galactic civilizations now consider human emotional technology to be essential infrastructure. Reality itself has apparently accepted that human complaints constitute a legitimate form of feedback. The transformation was complete. The species that had been dismissed as primitive had become the galaxy's most essential civilization simply by refusing to accept that the universe's rules were non-negotiable. They had looked at the fundamental laws of physics, decided those laws were inconvenient, and somehow convinced reality to offer better customer service. Admiral Riles concluded the diplomatic meeting with the same calm confidence he had shown during humanity's first appearance before the Council. "We appreciate the galaxy's interest in our technology," he said simply. "We look forward to continued cooperation in making the universe a more reasonable place to live." As the various delegations departed, each carrying contracts for human consciousness-enhanced technology, the observation deck fell quiet. Ambassador Thrix remained behind, studying the view of human space where stars seemed to shine with slightly more consideration for their observers and planets orbited with the kind of precision that suggested they were genuinely trying to do their best. "How did you know?" Thrix asked finally. "How did your species know that the universe would listen to your complaints?" Riles considered the question for a moment, watching a human transport convince an asteroid to move out of its way through what appeared to be a polite but firm conversation. "We didn't know," he admitted. "We just assumed that if something wasn't working the way it should, someone ought to complain about it loudly enough to get it fixed." The galaxy had learned the most important lesson in human philosophy, sometimes the most effective approach to an impossible problem is to refuse to accept that it's impossible and keep complaining until someone in authority does something about it. In this case, the authority had turned out to be the universe itself, and it had proven to be surprisingly responsive to customer feedback. Humanity's greatest weapon hadn't been their technology or their tactics. It had been their absolute refusal to accept poor service from reality itself. They had filed a complaint with the Cosmos about the inconvenience of physical laws, and the Cosmos had apparently decided that the customer was always right. The universe, it seemed, had a customer service department after all. and humanity had found its direct line.